Hello and welcome to the Hay Festival Book Club, which this month is taking on Kafka's Metamorphosis, a book which many would argue is the greatest short story ever written by one of the last century's most influential writers. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Manveen Rana. I'm a journalist at The Times and The Sunday Times, and I present their daily podcast, The Story, so if you're in the market for one, do have a listen. Very excitingly, I'm also joined by a panel of world experts, really, on Kafka, for the most authoritative analysis possible on this book. But before we get there, just a very quick reminder. The Hay Festival Book Club, which is supported by the Unwin Charitable Trust, looks at a new book every month, and May's selection is Knife by Salman Rushdie. And there will be a special event with the author to explore the book. You can find more details online. And if you want to buy a copy of Knife or of Metamorphosis, if you haven't got yours already, then you can buy both online at the Hay Festival website or from your local bookseller. Back to tonight's text, and I'm so pleased to be joined online by Carolin Duttlinger, Professor of German Literature and Culture at the University of Oxford and co-director of the Oxford Kafka Research Centre. I love that they have one. She's also the author of several books, including Kafka and Photography, and she curated a series of essays on the author in a book called Kafka in Context. So if Metamorphosis has whet your appetite, do have a look. We're also joined by Michael Hofmann, who is both an award-winning poet and an incredibly influential translator. He's translated more than 70 books from German, including works by Kafka, Hans Fallada, and Joseph Roth. He teaches at the University of Florida. We're so delighted that you can both be with us to guide us through this month's book. We've had an avalanche of questions coming in from the audience. I'll try and get through as many as possible before the end. Before that, though, I really wanted to start by asking you both. Metamorphosis was published in 1915. How relevant is it still as a book for our times? Carolin, do you want to begin?
I think instead of calling it relevant, I would maybe call it timeless, because it's actually a very simple story, which doesn't require you to know very much at all about Kafka's own life, about Prague, about Austro-Hungary, all of that context, because it's really a story that's stripped down to its bare bones, that the action never really leaves the flat until right at the end. And what it really is of course, a story about a family. And so I think it's very relatable in its simplicity, but also incredibly memorable and powerful in the way that it just describes this shocking event, which happens right at the start, and then really just observes how events unfold after this really dramatic beginning.
Michael, for you, how much is it still really a book of our era?
Of our era. It doesn't change. It seems fairly sort of imperishable to me. It is whatever defines a classic. I guess it's a classic, which you could say involves a certain degree of simplicity, a certain degree of outrage, possibly, a sense of consequence. Something like that.
What do you think? This is one of the central questions, I suppose. But what do you think Kafka is trying to achieve by making his protagonist, from the very first sentence, a bug?
I think he always begin all his beginnings. I think it's always too late when a Kafka piece begins, and everything is payoff or payback or payout, and. I think he tries to, perhaps it's a generalization, but and the opposite of a generalization, because generalization is another generalization. But he perhaps tries to get himself into a really a terminal position, and perhaps work his way back from there, or work his. The huntsman Gracchus. People who are sort of dead and alive. The character in a box. The penal colony. The trial where Joseph K hasn't done anything wrong, but the two men come knocking on his door. It's too late.
Carolin, that's such a great description. A Kafkaesque story is one that starts where it's already too late. How else would you describe the oeuvre? Is it, you know, is it alienation? Is it a sense of futility against unexpected, extraordinary circumstances? How would you sum it up?
I mean, I think what's remarkable is the incredible tension between the events that are unfolding, which are very dramatic. I mean, effectively, this is a son who is killed by his own family, marginalized, imprisoned in his own bedroom. He comes out 3 times, and there's a sort of build-up of tension and violence, really, this standoff between the son and the father. And then, of course, he dies alone in his room. So he will actually, Gregor never leaves the family flat. The rest of the family escape at the end. So there's a sort of epilogue as well. But I think what's remarkable is that the events are dramatic, shocking, upsetting, but the style is incredibly toned down and factual and unemotional and very precise at the same time. So it's not, perhaps, if you only know what it's about, if you only know the bare bones of the story, you might expect something quite racy and expressionistic, but it's not like that. It's actually a very coolly narrated story, which nonetheless, and I'm sure Michael will talk about this, is very hard to translate in its simplicity and has a lot of hidden depths, even down to individual words. And of course, the opening sentence is a famous example.
Well, I was going to ask Michael, tell us, what sort of a bug is he? From the very start, we're not quite sure.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I mean, it's a book that's been, that at the time I translated it, had been translated before, several times, many times. And since I've done it, it's been translated again. I'm sure it's being translated as we speak. Ein ungeheures Ungeziefer. Ungeheuer, monster, not to be ungeheuer. Heuer is you know, is today, if it's related to heute and so on. Don't know for sure if it is or not. Ungeheuer. It's a monster, an atrocity. Ungeziefer, to uns. I don't know the etymology of entomology. The entomology.
And just explain what you mean by the 2 uns.
The entomology of Ungeziefer. Just the 2 prefixes for the 2 verbs coming one after the other. Ein ungeheures Ungeziefer. This is who wakes up in Gregor's bed, and it has been translated as insect. I think bug is harmless. Ungeziefer gets translated as vermin. I think vermin is not a useful word in English. You know, it's because it's been translated, you know, because other translations exist. And a friend of mine said, "You're not going to make him an insect, are you?" I made him a cockroach. And this is partly from doing it in Florida, where they abound. And partly for a change, and partly because I think it's to sort of add to what Carolin was saying. There was it's also sort of a young man in a family, but it's also probably to do with self-loathing, self-dislike, and there is Kafka, and a cockroach in German is a Kakerlake, and Kafka often plays with his name. So Gregor Samsa is a play on Kafka because it has the vowels and consonants in the same place. I think Kafka being called Kafka meant that he couldn't use a word like Kakerlake, but I think if German had been different, he might have done. And I think someone like Nabokov going into what kind of insect Gregor was is barking up the wrong tree. I think
we should just explain. I hadn't realized this, but now Nabokov, who not only lectured on Kafka, but was also an expert on all insects. So he tried to actually work out exactly what kind of an insect and what sort of size he would be by the way he manages to reach handles and moves around.
Right. Yes, thank you. I mean, he's a butterfly collector. But I love the surmise that Gregor, had he but known it, might have been able to fly. That seems certainly a sort of possible. And later, sort of in the middle of the book, he finds out. I mean, he loves going around the walls. I mean, he likes hanging on the ceiling and letting himself drop. I mean, he is. I think there's, you could. I'm happy with Cockroach.
Carolin, are you happy with Cockroach? I know. Kafka didn't seem to want to define exactly what kind of a bug this was.
I mean, I think no single translation is going to render what Kafka does in the original. And just to come back to the two prefixes, I mean, basically you've got two negative forms here in the first sentence, which immediately creates this sense of uncertainty. There's almost like a vacuum of meaning. So ungeheuer meaning monstrous. But interestingly, the word geheuer is probably less common than the word ungeheuer. So it's a word that's more common in the negative than in the positive form. And it already sort of hints at this sort of something that's too monstrous to be comprehended. And then the Ungeziefer, so just to add to what Michael was saying, one definition of that term, or one etymological root, is that Ungeziefer are animals which are not fit to be sacrificed. So they're unclean animals as well. And even though, of course, this story isn't set in a specifically Jewish context, it's sort of set in this, as I said, sort of fairly placeless family. It's just a middle-class bourgeois, maybe petit bourgeois family. I think there are these resonances of taboos, of like sacrifice, of, of course, we can think of Freud in the context of the father-son conflict. And I think the idea with this sort of core image of the vermin, the bug, the cockroach, whatever you want to call it, is just actually a paradox, because, of course, Gregor, up until his transformation, was the one who was the breadwinner in the family. And the rest of the family, in particular the parents, were the parasites. They were living off his hard labor, not doing very much. We're told the father would often stay in his dressing gown until lunchtime, just sitting at the breakfast table, reading the newspaper. And so it's Gregor who is keeping these parasites, as it were, in a nice, comfy lifestyle. His sister doesn't do very much. And once the transformation happens, all of that changes, of course. The father gets a job in a bank, he starts wearing a uniform, the mother takes on sewing work, the sister becomes a shop girl. And of course, in a sense, it's not just one story, it's a story of 4 transformations, because everyone changes in the family. So the title is The Metamorphosis in the singular. And I think the is actually very important. But really, it's a story of all characters changing, and it is a coming of age story really for the sister, for Grete, who in my view is perhaps the most interesting character in the story.
Yeah, there's that amazing moment at the end where she sort of emerges as if from a chrysalis. Let's talk about that, because as you pointed out, one of the reasons I think this book has such universal appeal is because it sort of sets up these oppressive family dynamics that most people can sort of relate to some degree. Tell me about your interpretation of his relationship with the sister, because it seems to change so much through the course of one short story.
Yeah, so I think that's right. I think that's the core relationship, and it's sort of a barometer of the whole story and how that goes. So at the very beginning, the sister is knocking at the door saying, Gregor, are you all right? And already it's notable that his room has 2 doors. So there are people knocking from 2 sides. So there's this sense of stress and exposure as he tries to get out of bed. Later on, the sister will sort of become his carer. So she brings him food. She tries out different foods. She notices he no longer likes bread and milk, which used to be his favorite dish. She brings him rotting food, which he loves. And then this sort of role of the carer, of the person who's looking after him, gradually becomes more sinister. So there's this important middle part where the mother and the sister want to clear out his room, because actually the sister notices that he started crawling all over the walls and ceiling, as Michael already mentioned. So they think, actually, what use is his furniture? Let's just create more space for him. And Gregor then actually doesn't like this idea, and he crawls onto a picture on the wall and scares his mother. The mother faints, and so on. But I think it's that moment which is the tipping point, because it's actually Gregor for the first time rebelling against what the mother and especially the sister have decided is in his best interests. And after that, the sister sort of really starts turning against him. And towards the end of the third part, when he comes out for a last time, interrupting this amazing scene where the sister is playing violin for the three lodgers, after he's driven back into his room, the sister says to the parents, "It must die. This is no longer working." It's also the moment where in the German Kafka switches from er, which is he, to it. So you could say that it's only at that point that the transformation is complete. And so actually, even though readers have often argued it's the father who delivers the fatal blow, it's the father who throws that apple which lodges itself in his back and which causes that fatal wound, I really think it's the sister who pronounces that death sentence after which he actually dies. Does that make her a baddie? I don't know, because of course, as you say, at the end, she emerges from her chrysalis, probably to be married off. That's kind of the conclusion Kafka leaves us with. So it's a very, very ambivalent story, and I'm not sure quite where our sympathies lie. They probably lie with Gregor. It'll be interesting to hear from Michael how he saw that as he was translating it. But the sister, I think, is actually quite a powerful and slightly sinister, but also quite a strong character.
Michael, what did you make of her? Because when he's thinking about his family, she's clearly the one he has the most sympathy for and is closest to.
Well, as a brother of sisters, I suppose my sympathies are with Gregor. But I mean, yeah. I mean, two things. One, he is. I mean, his thinking throughout is so, and his care, his inner processing of things, and his desire to take a hand and to help are maintained really throughout the entire thing, and they are very, very touching. I mean, so he's thinking towards the end when she's playing her violin, she's thinking that he had intended at Christmas to say that he was going to get her into a music academy, and that was going to be his gift to her. He is really endlessly nurturing, solicitous of the whole family, wondering how they will get by without his income. That's one thing I want to, I mean, he's obviously the central figure, but it's true. I mean, I like the idea of gears always in Kafka. There are lots of moving parts. The sentence is often composed of an unusual number of moving parts, which makes it generally so difficult to translate. But so there's this one principal cog is Gregor, but everything else is in motion as well. And I think it was interesting that I think the end of the second paragraph, Gregor was looking at this picture he had framed. He does a little bit of woodworking on the side. It's such a completely touching story, and he's made himself a little frame, and the thing he's put in the frame is of a woman in a fur hat and a feather and a fur boa, and with her arms stuck into this fur muff. And it's this photograph, and I know Carolin has written about photography in Kafka, and I think, well, anyway, I think photographs in Kafka are absolutely crucial, like the photograph of Abraham Lincoln in America. But it's this photograph that Gregor comes out to defend when the cleaning and the emptying of his room is in process, and he covers it with his entire big fat flat body, and he feels its cool glass against his belly, and it's almost a sort of replay of the sort of furry sexuality at the beginning becomes a kind of glass sexuality with this as he plasters himself over this photograph.
Carolin, tell us about that, because as Michael set out there is that sort of that odd moment with the glass and the photograph, but there's almost a slightly sexual moment with the sister at one point when she's playing music and he starts talking about her lack of a collar and wanting to sort of reach up. Tell us a bit about, is there a moment where it could almost be a sexual form of love?
Absolutely. And I think that's a fascinating moment. So he is watching her play. He's come out of his room. The others in the room are watching her as well. They haven't yet noticed him. So it's a moment of incredible suspense, because you have to remember by that point they've taken in the lodgers who have no idea what's hiding behind that closed door. So here he is watching his sister, and he fantasizes about, because he's incredibly jealous of these three lodgers, because it's very clear the lodgers are paying guests. What do they get for their money? They get food cooked by the mother, brought to the table, which they devour with their great big mouths and their strong teeth. The parents are eating in the kitchen, presumably, so they've already colonized the living room table. And then on top of the meal, they get offered up this young girl who has to perform for them. So there's already an incredible sexual tension there, because the sister is clearly another commodity that's thrown into the mix. And so Gregor sees himself in direct rivalry to these three men. And that's when he has that fantasy of, in a sense, kidnapping his sister, locking her up in his bedroom. And crucially, this fantasy is based on the fact that he is an animal, that he is an insect, not a human, because he specifically imagines raising himself up, so he's below her, underneath her, raising himself up to kiss her neck. And then he thinks that he will use his animal form to scare off any intruders. So what we've got here, people often talk about the Metamorphosis as a sort of dark anti-fairy tale. Of course, that's true. But I think this specifically is a sort of Beauty and the Beast moment, really. It's Gregor for the first time thinking, hang on, I desire my sister as an animal, not as a human. And so what Kafka does so amazingly well, because he doesn't, nothing much changes over the course of the story, apart from the arrival of these new characters. But what he does so well is he sort of digs deep and he excavates all these layers of fantasies and emotions and the emotional dynamics within the family. So it's really about a growing intensity rather than throwing in lots of different things, which is what Kafka does in his first novel, The Man Who Disappeared, and what he does again in The Trial, which is much more a sort of serial novel where in each chapter the protagonist meets a new person and is in a new place and new things happen. The Metamorphosis is incredibly intense and claustrophobic, because it's just about depth, and it's about these layers of emotions that gradually come to the surface.
And if the relationship with the sister is the most important in the book, then surely the second most important is the relationship with the father. Michael, what did you make of that, of the way he describes his father throughout?
Well, it reminds me, I suppose, of the Judgment, which is the slightly earlier story, which is when it said Kafka became Kafka. The story of really the sort of the transfer of power from son to father, which sort of feels vaguely counter-cyclical, but I mean, in Kafka it happened, or that in the Judgment, Gail Benderman thinks he's an age and standing, and his father has been widowed, and he's been looking after his father, and he thinks he's keeping his father under his wing, but then his father turns up into this terrifyingly powerful, virile, just colossus. When the father sort of is jumping up and down on the bed in his dressing gown. So many of the scenes are so sort of ridiculous. And there's a little bit of a sort of similar motion to that in Metamorphosis. When the father, as Carolin said, the father had been retired, had stopped working to sort of 2 or 3 years ago, and was reading the newspaper till lunchtime, so forth. And the father has been reactivated, to use a sort of Kafka type term, almost in a sort of military sense, and the importance of the uniform. And then, I mean, it's just the wonderful thing about the story is that things keep happening in it. Everything is in flux. Things go up, things go down. So he has this concierge's uniform, but later that's sort of going to seed it, because it gets covered with food and it gets kind of grubby and grimy, and he's sort of falling asleep in his chair again at the end of the day, and it's the values keep going up and down. The whole thing is in continual flux, and so you might have thought the father was sort of ready to be put away, as you say, of an opponent at the beginning, but no, he comes up and sort of by the end, so he almost goes through sort of 2 complete cycles, because at the end he is sort of squire with you have to imagine a woman on each arm, his wife, who I also find the mother very interesting, his wife on one arm and his little girl Greta on the other. And he squires them, and he marches them off on the tram to the town park. And he's ein gestandener Mann. He's a sort of admirable bourgeois.
Very much the man again.
Very
Carolin,
much.
how much does this portrayal of a father-son relationship, where he's almost sort of squashed by the size of the father, how much does it reflect Kafka's relationship with his own father?
That's, of course, always the big question that people ask. And on some level, maybe it's a cliche, Kafka and his father complex. But of course,
he sort of wrote the cliche, didn't he?
Absolutely. Kafka, of course, put this out himself by writing this over 100-page long letter to his father. This was after the Metamorphosis, but of course, both of them built on years and years of what must have been a very difficult relationship. If you read this letter to his father, which incidentally he probably gave to his mother to deliver, but the mother certainly never gave it to the father. So it became a sort of, it is really the closest we have to Kafka's autobiography. It's a very bitter document, but it's also a very clever, almost a lawyerly document where Kafka preempts any objection to what he is saying. So he always there's always these sort of dialectical turns where he says, but you might say this, but no, I've already anticipated that. And so, as Michael says, this theme of like the colossal father towering over the tiny son, which we get in the Judgment, we get in the Metamorphosis, we get again in that letter where Kafka talks about, going to the Lido with his father as a young boy, and they're in the changing room, and he feels like he's this skinny little nothing, and his father is this virile giant. So a lot of that relationship, like the relationship with the sister, is about sexuality and about feeling sexually inadequate. Kafka says in that letter, the only real goal in life is to have a family, to be the head of a family. And that is precisely what I will never be able to achieve, because you, father, have already occupied that role in such a way that I had to find something else to do with myself. So that's really quite a radical, maybe sort of bleak statement. The reason I became an author was not because I wanted to, but because it was the only thing left for me to do. I mean, I think Kafka is quite disingenuous there. I think that letter is not an objective and certainly not a balanced account of that relationship. I think it came at a point when Kafka had been diagnosed with tuberculosis, when he felt very bitter about his life. But nonetheless, I think you could read both the letter and the Metamorphosis as two sides of the same coin, as a way in which Kafka narrates his life and creates these roles both for himself and for his son characters, which are very extreme and very dramatic roles.
And he does talk in the letter again about insects, vermin that sort of suck the blood of people to survive, which is what the family in this book seems to be doing. It does feel like a lot of the relationships are very transactional. I mean, is this also about, I know he wrote it before he was sick, but is it almost a book about sickness and not being useful anymore, and therefore being a burden on other people, but also being ignored, being no longer valued?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it only becomes clear after he has transformed that, in fact, the whole family relationship was already transactional beforehand. In fact, there's a sort of little flashback where he remembers when he first starts his job, he first brings home his month's wages. They're incredibly grateful. They're so happy. Never have we been happier before or after. But then they get used to it. And he just becomes this drudge who has to bring in the money. And then there's this really devastating moment when he overhears them talking next door about their finances. And it turns out they've actually stashed away some money, because the reason he's working so hard is that the parents have debts with his boss, and so he's paying off the debt and working himself almost to death. But they've actually stashed away some money, so he could have stopped working so hard, but they just allowed him to carry on. And so it is absolutely about this sense that if you don't provide the money, if you are not worth something according to this capitalist system, you are really nothing. You are worse than nothing. And in that sense, I think it is still a very topical story for our times.
Mm. And you mentioned the capitalist system. I mean, I'm always fascinated by the cleaner, who seems to be the only one who's completely unfussed by the bug, and sort of almost communicates with it without being just repulsed, and is the one who's left having to sort out the body at the end, and then gets sacked for her efforts. What should we make of her? Michael, what did you make of the cleaner?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think there's sort of, I mean, with England, with English and so on. I mean, I think there's there's always a little sort of a little sort of suspicion of class comedy or something like that, and it's hard to write a character like that in English and not think of think of English BBC upstairs downstairs comedies, and to give the cleaner a bit of an accent, or how is she going to say, is she going to call him a stink bug, or what was she going to call him, and her kind of her streetiness and her matiness and so on. She does come on like a kind of breath of some kind of air, but I mean, it's not necessarily fresh air, but she's a power.
Carolin, what did you make of her?
Yeah, she's an interesting character because she is the third woman in the story, really. And where does she sit, really? In fact, there is another maid right at the beginning, but that maid gets so freaked out, she begs to be dismissed, and so she leaves. And then there's this sort of vacuum where presumably the mother and the sister do the cleaning. And then this new coarse woman is brought in. I mean, it's notable, she is not afraid to go into the room. She doesn't seem to have that sort of horror or the sort of, just inability. I mean, the mother can barely look at him. The mother, incidentally, and I also agree with Michael, the mother is very interesting as a character. The mother insists on saying that Gregor is her son. He is still my son, after all. So she is, in a sense, most loyal to Gregor, but for that reason, she basically faints the moment she sees him up there on the picture. And the cleaning woman has none of this sort of, none of this squirmishness, which probably does come down to class. So there is that class dimension very much. I think it's also, among other things, a story about the fear of social decline, the fear of like not being able to keep up your middle class lifestyle. Of course, this idea that the sister will go to the conservatoire, it's a very middle class, it's very aspirational family. The cleaning woman, I think, brings in that element of class very forcefully. But I think it's also very interesting that as soon as he dies, she gets ejected from the family again. So it's almost like she is the other parasite, the other vermin that they need to get rid of. So they sort of clear out everyone. They clear out the body, she clears out the body, they clear out the cleaner, and they immediately kick out the three lodgers as well. So it's this interesting moment where the cast of the story expands and then it contracts again.
Family is a real gut. I mean, it operates as an awful sort of squeezing motions. It's very
yes, suddenly expanding and then contracting.
Yeah, and they've gone away to downsize themselves. They've gone away to as you know, their anxiety about class, but they're going away to more sort of circumstance appropriate flat that will without the central room that their misslungna zone, that their kind of failed son has occupied in the last life.
Because of course they were trapped in that flat as well because they couldn't leave as long as he was there.
Although they posit a way they could have done if they were just smart enough, effectively. They could have boxed him up. And that's never an option. It's very damning about the whole family, really.
Yeah.
Michael, you mentioned the mother. Is she written more sympathetically? You know, there's always a better excuse for her not doing things. She has the asthma. She
I think she
would do more if she could.
I think she's not. I think somewhere she's really poisonous. I mean, I think that. I mean, I may have this wrong, but I mean, when she comes in, that mild voice that Kafka says. And there's, I think she's always she feels bound by duty. She doesn't quite fit into her role. She doesn't really. I mean,
oh, I think we've lost Michael for a moment. Michael, can you hear us? Well, we'll try. Oh, you're back.
Am I? I'm sorry. Sorry. She doesn't. Okay. She says she doesn't. She doesn't fully occupy her role. She slips as the cog. I think the part is maybe too big for her. Asks too much of her. She can't quite fill her part. From the beginning of that mild voice, and the sort of occasional pictures of her sort of in the next room struggling with a huge wardrobe. There's something sort of inadequate to, I would say, untrustworthy about her.
Yeah, she's sort of fulfilling the part that she should be playing, but leaves a lot of it to the sister, I suppose.
Yeah.
This book sort of sometimes gets described as a comedy. Do you think it is one? Carolin?
I think it starts off very funny, because what's so incredibly funny at the beginning is that Gregor can't accept what has just happened and is determined to go to work. And that's an incredibly funny moment, how he thinks, okay, I've missed the 6:30, I'll just aim for the 7:10 or something. Quick. And then, of course, at the beginning, the other stressful intruder is his boss from work, who turns up almost like that, you know, so he's 20 minutes late. The boss is already in the flat, pretty frightening character. And so Gregor tries to shout through the door and gives this long monologue where he says, it's all right, I'm coming, I'm going to make up for it, I'm going to work extra hours, don't worry. And he gives this, it's almost a paragraph of sort of frantic reassurance as he scrambles to get himself out of bed, which takes ages. It takes almost half a chapter. And then there's this deafening silence after this long monologue. And then the boss, the procurist, says one sentence, and it is, "That was an animal's voice." And it's just one of the most amazing moments in the story, because that's when everything collapses. And this theme of voice is very interesting because he speaks before that moment. He kind of calls out to his mother that he's getting up already and so on. And we get the feeling they understand him at the beginning. Maybe his voice sounds a bit strange. Maybe he has a cold, they think. But it's at that point where he seems to have shifted or sort of dropped down on that sort of ladder, of evolution. So he's lost his voice. He had the voice and then he's lost it. So that's a sort of darkly comical moment, I guess. Gregor trying to pretend it's business as usual. And I think it does turn, of course, darker and more tragic as it goes on. So I think the comedy is very much in that first part. Maybe there are other comic moments, but certainly when Kafka had finished the story, he writes a letter to his later fiancée, Felice Bauer, in Berlin, and he says to her, "Cry, dearest, cry, because the hero of my little story has just died, though he died feeling reconciled with his family." And so I think there is a sort of arch from comedy to tragedy, really, in the course of the story.
And Michael, did you find moments of, I mean, does it ever actually make you laugh, or is it just a very dark?
I mean, I have to say it does. I mean, I think there's a lot of sort of I mean, business with Kafka's with Gregor's new body, with his legs, with his feelers, which is all done very, very imaginatively, really beautifully, and the sort of the counterpointing of Gregor's thinking and what he's sort of physically doing. I think a lot of sort of comedy of consciousness of what is sort of his, I suppose, is his slipping expectations, something like that. Of the keeping up of illusions, I suppose. There's sort of that. I do think it's comic. I mean, my father read it to us when we were little, and I was probably 8 or 9 or something when I first heard it. And the thing that really got me always was the little dessert apples that just fitted as though to measure in poor Gregor's carapace, and that I mean that would really still make me cry.
I think that phrase of a comedy of consciousness is really interesting. It's the same in The Trial, by the way. I think they're both narratives about characters deceiving themselves and trying to keep up these illusions about their own control of the situation. And it is incredibly funny how these characters just cannot quite accept reality.
And we started, Carolin, by talking about how one of the reasons this book still has such a following is because there is universality about it being set in a flat amongst one family, where it could be anywhere. But how much is Kafka's writing and the writing of this book influenced by the setting, by when and where he was writing, the context around him?
I mean, Kafka was very much of a similar class to the family he describes, and people have even mapped the apartment's layout onto the actual flat in which Kafka was living at the time. So there is obviously a biographical link. I think more generally there is that sort of aspirational family background that was very much the background of Kafka's parents. They had a shop. They were aspirational German Jewish people who'd worked their way out of the ghetto. So it was that was very much, they were strivers, as we would say today. Yeah, so I think all of that definitely rings very true. I mean, the setting of the flat as opposed to maybe a house, I think that's very important. The way you have like the staircase going down, people coming up and so on. It's also important what he sees through the window, which is a hospital opposite. This, by the way, wasn't what Kafka would have seen from his window. But I think, again, as I said before, it's that sense of claustrophobia, the small life. These are people with small minds that lead small lives that are rushed. There's not much space to do anything with that life. Michael mentioned him making that frame. I think that's, the mother says at some point, the only thing Gregor ever allows him to do in the evening when he's not studying the timetables for the next day is he made this little frame, Laubsägearbeit, and I think she calls it, so like woodworking. But other than that, there's no indication that he reads, that he has any interests. He doesn't really seem to have any friends. No one seems to come and ask for him. I mean, if you imagine you just disappear in your room for months on end and no one seems to notice that you're gone. Which I think, by the way, is also why it was such a resonant story with people during lockdown, that sense of just being stuck in one room and that's it. And the only people you ever see are the three people who have to share that flat with you.
Michael, for you, particularly, I suppose, when you're translating, how much do you have to think about the context in which he was writing about, the Prague he was writing in, or?
Yeah. I mean, the presentation seems very theatrical. I mean, you find this room, the door to the left, door to the right. We are sort of the fourth wall. Doesn't change. Occasional moments of, I mean, these are also moments of physical comedy. Say when the boss is running, the boss is sort of retreats and then he finally turns to run down the stairs, and Kafka describes the sole of his foot still clinging to the floor, and it's I mean, it brings up the whole of silent film comedy. Well, there's a thing in America when Man Who Disappeared, when a policeman are described running around a corner, which is, and it's like the Keystone Cops. The sort of perpetual movement, perpetual commentary, and the consciousness, I think, going in zigzags. I mean, there's a little sort of hopeful moment, and then a little less hopeful moment, and he discovers that his legs work, and he thinks his problems are over. Just staying abreast of all that, and in English, just trying to prevent the thing from getting too warm, too pally, too chummy, which I think are all the sort of the draws of English, because it's a language you can be warm and pally and chummy in. And I'm aware of that, and I think someone else says. I mean, I said it. Translation is exaggeration. So he's a cockroach, and Greta at the end becomes nubile, and those are sort of the posts between which I hang my translation.
I wanted to ask you both before we move on to the audience questions. This one short story seems to have had such a huge impact on literature and on writers. For you, what is the legacy of Metamorphosis? Carolin, do you want to go first?
It's a difficult question because I'm not a creative writer, but I know that, of course, creative artists of all media have found it a very powerful story. I think different people have taken away different things from it. I mean, for me, what is inspirational is just the simplicity of it, as I said at the beginning, and the way that Kafka actually takes us to very dark places, but he never gets overexcited. He doesn't milk the emotional moments. So for me, Kafka, above all, I think his legacy for me is less in terms of the plots he created, even though, of course, this image of a man turned into a bug is so powerful, because I think, as Michael said earlier, there's a degree of self-loathing here. It's all of that. but I think it's really the clarity of that vision with which Kafka creates that world and the absolute determination. If you look at the manuscript, the first page, there's hardly a word crossed out. By the way, if I may just say that we're going to show that opening page of the Metamorphosis in Oxford at our Kafka Making of an Icon exhibition, which opens on the 30th of May, free of charge. And it's going to be the biggest exhibition of Kafka's original manuscripts ever, to mark the centenary of his death, of course, this year. It's going to bring together also manuscripts from Israel, some of his drawings that have not been seen in the UK. So, but yeah, I think
perfectly timed for the Hay Festival Book Club.
You look at that first page, and I think you see that clarity and that determination.
Michael, for you, what is his legacy?
I think it's paying attention. I think it's taking steps, just to, I mean, describing how Gregor gets out of bed, how he tries to rock, and then he decides he's going to be hard enough to withstand any shock, and continues to think and continues to negotiate his problems one at a time, even in a completely kind of perspectiveless situation. And that's, it's what we do. It's what we do. We're all in the, but it's what one does.
I'm going to try and move on to the audience questions, just so that we can get in as many as possible before this session is over. We've got one here from Francis saying, why were so few of Kafka's works published within his lifetime?
Yeah, it's a big question. So the simple answer is that none of the 3 novels were finished. They were all unfinished in different ways, interestingly. The trial has an ending, but it's still an unfinished novel. I think Kafka really struggled to finish stuff. Michael mentioned The Judgment. This was a story he wrote over the course of a single night in about 8 hours, but he later struggled to repeat that experience. So I think Kafka was something of a perfectionist, and so therefore he always gravitated towards shorter forms, which he could finish in that immersive way. But yes, only about 1/20th of what we now have of his writings was published in his lifetime, which is a very small proportion, of course. And he did famously ask his friend Max Brod to burn all the unpublished manuscripts after his death, which famously Brod ignored. But if you imagine,
we're lucky to have what we have. Really.
We would only have 5% of the Kafka we have.
Gosh,
but it was still 6 books. I mean, it's not, I mean, one shouldn't, I mean, it's, he was also he couldn't live by it, I suppose, but he was he must have thought of himself as a writer. And in a sense, in the rest of this this other 95%, I mean, my own sympathies go with the tiny things, the unconsidered things, the he describes he's described as the great fragmentarian, which I think is true by Rainer Schach, by his biographer. And he found a new form for literature, which is these. I mean, Ted Hughes calls them orts, ORTS, just beginnings, little specks, and that probably is his form more. And I think it's rather extraordinary that I suppose he wrote and finished as much as he did. I mean, I love the tiny things, silly things. I love Poseidon sitting at his desk, exhausted by managing the sea.
We've got a question from Shoned, who asks, if I'd like to discover more Kafka, what other works would you recommend? You've mentioned a few of these during the course of our discussion, but Carolin, is there a particular order you'd recommend reading them in?
So I myself read the Metamorphosis first. My friend was reading it at school. She lent it to me. I was hooked. And then I did read the trial second. So a very cliched path into Kafka. So of course, the trial is the other big iconic text. Although of the three novels, my personal preference is The Man Who Disappeared or America, because it's just a bit more fast paced, more happens. It's not quite as bleak. The Castle is the last one and is rather long. I mean, it is objectively the longest, but it's also quite not that much happens. I think I love the Castle, but it's maybe the one to leave till later once you're a sort of confirmed Kafka fan. But I do agree that Kafka is the master of the short form, and some of these very, very short texts, which may or may not be finished, are an absolute joy to read because they are really funny. They are so quirky in the premise they describe. They take us to exotic places. So it's actually in his short stories that he travels the world, that he travels to Africa and China and so on, to Russia. And they are just amazing the way he lets his imagination roam. In the 1920s, he starts writing weird sort of riffs on biblical tales like the Exodus story, the prodigal son, an amazing little piece called I Have Returned, which I think, Michael, you have translated, which is just so evocative. It tells the story of the prodigal son from the perspective of the returning son. So I think really, please read those unknown stories. Don't stop at the Metamorphoses.
Michael, what's your favorite?
I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think the big things you have them after a while, but I mean, the rest of it is so surprising and so zestful. Oddly, I mean, this little book. I didn't translate it all that much, but this little book called The Lost Writings, which are sort of 50 or so little pieces that Rainer Stach found that we thought hadn't appeared in English. I think some of them maybe had. I don't know. I mean, I'm really not the expert. I do what's put in front of me. But just the sort of the attack of those things and the speed in which you are in a predicament. I mean, the way he can establish a predicament in nothing flat is amazing.
Yeah. We've got a question from Julie. Carolin, which contemporary novels or writers would you recommend for people who love Kafka?
So I like Ishiguro's The Unconsoled. I think that's a very Kafkaesque novel. It's always difficult to talk about Kafka's legacy for me because I do find him very unique. But of course, there are people who sort of reflect that mood. So I like The Unconsoled because everything sort of happens slowly. He tries to go to bed, then he gets woken up again, which is this sort of maybe the spirit of the castle, really. Yeah, trying to think. There are a few German authors as well who try to riff on that, but I find a lot of the contemporary German responses to Kafka are a bit too cerebral in my mind. I prefer the sort of simple storytelling, really. I'll try to think while Michael answers that.
Yeah, Michael, which contemporary novels or writers would you recommend? But also, you've translated Hans Verlade's and Joseph Roth's. If you were to recommend people who are writing from that era, for people who have enjoyed reading Metamorphosis, who else would you recommend from them?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's a great time for German books. I mean, it was I mean, it's partly sort of individual, gifted individuals, but it's also partly the time. And I think the 20s were an amazing period. And it was sort of an amazing period on sort of Gothenburg scale, with film starting to feed into literature, but at the same time, people still bothering to write description. I mean, I love. I mean, my life has gone to Joseph Roth, who. I mean, I think that Germany feels like like Gregor's room, it feels like the middle of the world with sort of angry voices from left and right in the 20s. I think, I mean, he's not a novelist, but I would say possibly Charles Simic. Poems of Charles Simic, who died a couple of years ago, Serbian-American poet, has more Kafka in it than I think most, and has that sort of that straight ahead, that sort of naive, in over your head quality that Kafka has.
I mean, I've just been rereading 1984, and I was surprised how very different it reads from Kafka. I think it's they're often compared, dystopian and so on, but I think it's a completely, utterly different way of writing. It's so in your face, the whole world. I mean, of course, it is an amazing novel, but I think it's almost the exact opposite of what Kafka is trying to do. Kafka is about the unsettling nature of the everyday, and Orwell is really about creating these monstrous worlds, so you immediately thrown into that. But I think that comparison for me, to just remind myself how different a writer Orwell really is compared to Kafka.
You're so right. I'd quite like somebody to do a contemporary novel about the post office scandal in the style of Kafka, because I think that's probably something that most people would understand, being completely Kafkaesque right now. We are completely out of time, sadly. Yes, I know. Somebody write that. We have run out of time, annoyingly, but I look forward to one of you writing that book. Thanks so much to our brilliant guests tonight, Carolin, Duttlinger, and Michael Hofmann. And just a quick reminder that the Hay Festival Global is a charity with year-round activities to connect audiences with artists. And one of the biggest in every literary calendar is always the Hay Festival itself. And this year, that takes place between the 23rd of May until the 2nd of June. And you can now find a full programme online. Thank you to everyone who's managed to tune in. Thank you for the continued support and engagement, and hopefully see you at Hay.